You're listening to Briargrave Radio. Horror stories from the places the map forgot. I used to think silence was just the absence of sound, a neutral state, a blank space, a natural part of living alone. But the silence in my house changed. It shifted. It thickened. It became something I could feel pressing against my skin. And eventually, it stopped being empty. I didn't notice the transition immediately. It happened gradually, like a slow leak filling a room. The first sign was subtle, a faint pressure in the air whenever the house went quiet. Not a noise, not a vibration, just a weight, a presence. At first, I assumed it was stress, fatigue, the byproduct of too many late nights and too little sleep. But the silence persisted. It grew heavier, more deliberate, and then it began to respond. The first incident occurred on a Sunday afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, reading. The house was still, the kind of stillness that feels suspended, like the world is holding its breath. I turned a page. The silence shifted, not the air, not the floor, the silence itself. It tightened around me, as if the room were narrowing. I looked up from the book. Nothing had changed visually. The furniture was the same. The light was the same. The shadows were the same. But the silence was different. It was aware. I closed the book slowly. The silence thickened, as if reacting to the movement. I waited. The pressure eased slightly, like it was settling back into place. I told myself it was nothing, but I didn't open the book again. The second incident happened 2 days later. I came home from work and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet, not unusual, but the quiet felt occupied, as if someone had been speaking a moment before I arrived and had gone silent the instant I opened the door. I stood still. The silence stood with me. I walked into the kitchen. The silence followed. Not as sound, but as density, as presence, as attention. I opened the refrigerator. The hum of the motor broke the stillness. The pressure lifted. The silence retreated. When I closed the door, the hum stopped. The silence returned instantly. Closer. I left the kitchen. By the end of the week, the silence had become a constant companion. It lingered behind me in hallways. It pressed against me when I sat down. It shifted when I moved, like something adjusting its position to maintain proximity. I tried to ignore it. I failed. The silence was no longer passive. It was observant, intentional. It filled the house like a second atmosphere, thick and watchful. I began leaving the television on at night, not to watch, just to keep the silence at bay. But even then, I could feel it pressing against the edges of the sound, waiting for the moment the noise stopped. I slept poorly. I woke often. And each time, the silence was there, closer than before. The first unmistakable event happened on a Thursday. I was in the bedroom, preparing to sleep. The lamp was on. The room was quiet. I turned off the light. The silence surged forward. It wasn't darkness. Darkness is visual. This was tactile. A pressure that filled the room instantly, like a tide rushing in. I froze. The silence froze with me. I reached for the lamp. The silence tightened. My hand hovered above the switch. The silence leaned in. I turned the light back on. The pressure vanished. The room felt normal again. I slept with the lamp on. The next night, the silence made its first sound. I was lying in bed, eyes closed, trying to ignore the weight of the quiet pressing against the walls. The lamp was on. The room was still. Then I heard it. A soft exhale. Not breath, not wind, not anything natural. It was the sound of silence shifting, a subtle, deliberate movement of air without a source. I opened my eyes. The room was empty, but the silence was not. I sat up slowly. The silence recoiled, as if startled. The air felt colder, thicker. I waited. The silence waited with me. I whispered, "What do you want?" The silence pressed inward. Not an answer, a reaction. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the house felt different. The silence was no longer confined to rooms. It moved through the hallways like a slow current. It gathered in corners. It lingered behind doors. It pressed against the windows as if testing the boundaries of the house. I walked from room to room, listening. The silence followed. Not footsteps, not echoes, just presence. I stood in the living room and closed my eyes. The silence approached. I felt it gather around me, thick and cold, like fog without moisture. It pressed against my chest, my throat, my ears. I opened my eyes. The pressure eased. The silence retreated. It was learning. The first physical interaction happened that evening. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes. The water was running. The sound kept the silence at a distance. But when I turned off the faucet, the silence rushed in. I stepped back. The silence stepped forward. I reached for a towel. The silence shifted. The towel slipped from the counter. Not fell, slipped, as if nudged. I stared at it. The silence stared back. I picked up the towel slowly. The silence tightened around my hand, cold and heavy. I dropped the towel again. The silence loosened. I left the kitchen. By the end of the month, the silence had become territorial. It occupied certain rooms more heavily than others. The hallway near the bedroom was the worst. The silence there felt dense, almost physical. I avoided it when possible, but the silence didn't like being avoided. It followed me more aggressively. It pressed against me when I sat down. It hovered behind me when I stood still. It gathered around me when I tried to sleep. I began hearing faint movements at night, not footsteps, not breathing, just shifts in the air, like something repositioning itself in the dark. I stopped turning off the lights. The first major breach happened on a Tuesday. I was sitting in the living room, exhausted, staring at the wall. The house was quiet. The silence was heavy. Then the air in front of me rippled, not visually, audibly. The silence vibrated, a low resonant hum, like the sound of pressure building behind a sealed door. The air thickened. The room darkened, though the lights remained on. I stood slowly. The silence rose with me. The hum deepened. The air trembled. Then the silence split. A thin line opened in the center of the room, not a tear in space, but a fracture in the quiet itself. A seam of absolute stillness, sharper and colder than the surrounding air. I stepped back. The seam widened. A shape formed within it. Not a figure, not a shadow, a density. A concentration of silence so intense it distorted the air around it. I couldn't move, and the silence moved for me. It reached outward, not with limbs, with presence. A cold pressure touched my chest. I gasped. The silence recoiled. The seam closed. The room returned to normal. I collapsed onto the couch. The silence watched. After that, the house was no longer mine. The silence controlled the space. It dictated where I could walk, where I could sit, where I could sleep. Certain rooms became inaccessible, not physically, but atmospherically. The silence in them was too dense, too aware, too present. I avoided the bedroom entirely. I slept on the couch with the lights on. But even then, the silence found me. It gathered around the couch at night. It pressed against the cushions. It hovered above my face. It shifted when I breathed. Sometimes I woke to find the air around me trembling. Sometimes I woke to find the silence waiting, always closer than before. The final breach happened last night. I was sitting in the living room, exhausted, numb, waiting for the silence to make its next move. The house was still. The air was cold. The lights flickered. The silence thickened. It filled the room like a rising tide. I stood. The silence rose with me. I stepped back. The silence pressed forward. The air trembled. The walls vibrated. The silence split open. A seam of absolute stillness tore across the room, wider than before, deeper, darker. The density within it pulsed, expanding outward like a slow exhale. I couldn't breathe. The silence pressed against my chest, my throat, my skull. It wasn't attacking. It was entering. The seam widened. The silence poured out, cold, heavy, a presence without form or face. It surrounded me. It filled me. It whispered without sound. "You hear us now." I fell to my knees. The silence pressed closer. "You are not alone." The room darkened. The air vanished. The silence consumed everything. Not gone. Never gone. Just waiting, watching, listening. The house is quiet. But the quiet is no longer empty. It hasn't been empty for a long time. And now, neither am I. This has been Briargrave Radio. If tonight's story stayed with you, subscribe before the next signal comes through. And remember, not every place wants to be found.